Reconstructing philosophy. Welcome to the Reconstructing Philosophy podcast. This is the inaugural episode of the show where we will be showcasing philosophy and philosophers in the Southern Ontario region. The aim here is to give philosophers a chance to hear about what their colleagues are working on in the region, and perhaps the public at large can also get a chance to see what philosophers do. And in the process, we'd like to put philosophy in a larger social context. I am Matt Silk, and joining me for the first episode is Dr. Ian MacDonald from the University of Waterloo. Ian's interests lie in the history of philosophy, pragmatism, and the work of Charles Peirce. He has been awarded the Charles Saunders Peirce Essay Prize for his paper, Did Peirce Misrepresent Descartes? Reinvestigating and defended Peirce's case. And relatively recently, he defended his thesis on Peirce's critique of epistemic individualism. Ian, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me, Matt. It's nice to be here for the first episode, too.
Oh, thanks. Thanks for agreeing to be the first guest.
You're welcome.
So, it's kind of interesting that starting this podcast now during the lockdown, or as we're heading into yet another lockdown, I wanted to give philosophers a chance to sort of hear from each other and to hear what they're doing with this. That's kind of my hope. So I suppose I'll start with something simple. So what are you working on right now?
So right now I'm working on Peirce, of course, and his pragmatism, his pragmatism, going back to that. Also looking at his semiotic, which is his theory of signs. In large part, that's inspired from some friendships that I've had with other Peirce scholars, including my friend Scott Metzger, who's at the University of McMaster right now, and he's working on Peirce's theory of signs, which I find really interesting, especially in terms of, the nature of representation and the nature of thinking. I'm also working on this project that has to do with another figure who was a contemporary of Peirce's and a good friend of his, W.K. Clifford. He's the celebrated British mathematician working in the Victorian period, in the so-called Victorian crisis of faith. And he's famous for not only his contributions to mathematics, but also his influential address and essay known as The Ethics of Belief. And so I'm interested in that paper and what that's about, and sort of this intersection between what we might consider to be epistemic wrongs, but also ethical wrongs, and understanding the sort of nature of normativity, or what we mean by saying that we ought to believe certain things. And Clifford is widely known, if not notorious, for saying that we always need to believe what the evidence leads us to, or what the evidence supports. And so there's these sorts of questions that I'm starting to ask. And so it's both these figures of, Peirce and Clifford that I'm working on right now.
So Clifford's an interesting figure because he was somebody who thought that you should always have evidence. You should have sufficient reason to believe anything, and to not to do so would be an ethical wrong. Is that right?
That's correct. And so the question here is, what is the nature of that ethical wrong, right? That it's not just an epistemic wrong, but what does it mean for something to be wrong according to Clifford? And you said so, and I don't want to interrupt your next line of questioning, so go ahead.
Clifford sort of spearheaded this whole sort of interest in ethical issues regarding essentially knowledge claims. And maybe we should start where this kind of started, because he has a kind of interesting example that he sort of leads with.
Yes.
The ship example. Would you care to explain that, or?
Sure. So he starts off the Ethics of Belief, which was first an address to what was known as the Metaphysical Society, and then was given in a journal known as the Contemporary Review. And this was in 1876 and 1877. And so he starts off the paper and the address with the ship owner example. And the idea here is there's a ship owner who is ready to have these travelers go onto the ship, but he notices that the ship is, say, not well built, or that it has cracks in it, and that it doesn't seem to be seaworthy. Now, it seems that the evidence there is pointing to the ship not being ready to take these travelers across the ocean or wherever they have to go. But instead of heeding that evidence, the ship owner tries to convince himself out of these doubts that it won't be seaworthy and into a belief that it is seaworthy. And he does this, it seems, by a kind of deception or delusion, in that he wants to put his faith in providence, as Clifford says, or to convince himself against the evidence. And there seems to be something wrong with that. Now, the question about what the nature of this ethical wrong is one that comes up in the literature. And the work I'm doing now has to do with Clifford's account of the conscience and the community. And to sort of jump the gun here, my paper is going to be called Conscience and Community, Reinvestigating Clifford's Ethics of Belief. And it's going to try to look at some of these other features that we can get into if we'd like. But the ship owner example is one where the ship owner sees that there's evidence of damage to the ship, that it's likely not to be able to successfully go on this voyage. But he convinces himself out of that by stifling his doubts, Clifford says, or by, sort of not investigating this further, but believing that Providence will take care of these people. And one thing I should add here is that the Metaphysical Society was very much a debating society that had to do with this crisis of faith. So they're considering issues like whether or not they could still believe in God in light of, say, the writings of Charles Darwin, especially The Descent of Man and Origin of the Species, which threw, accounts of religion then, especially Christianity, into question about what is our place now in the world, particularly when it comes to, everything from the Genesis story to man or human beings having dominion over everything else on the planet. And so this really was something where you saw an intellectual confrontation between those who were staunchly defending Christianity and those who were so-called agnostics, or wanted to see where the evidence would lead one and maybe didn't suspend judgment on some of these matters or not endorse them because the evidence didn't support them. So agnostics such as Clifford himself, but also T.H. Huxley, so-called Darwin's bulldog, right? Among other figures in the society.
And it's interesting talking about this in the context of the sort of larger social and historical context, because while the Victorian crisis of faith was obviously the impetus behind perhaps some of these debates, they're still relevant today, not only for moral issues, or not only for religious issues rather, but because the issue still stands. I mean, we can see how this can be relevant to even COVID now, right? Like,
yes,
what should you believe about vaccines or the virus, or what should be done, and should you believe certain things or claim certain things without sufficient evidence, right?
Yes, very good. There's also this aspect, though, that Clifford talks about conscience as being fundamental, and that conscience and community need to be aligned, or there needs to be a supreme allegiance between the two. Why is this relevant? Because he thinks that conscience is a faith in humanity, or a faith in fellow members of society. And that matters because it sets up this state of trustworthiness, right? Where you're not going to say something that you don't have evidence for, or in spite of the evidence. And you're going to try to be as truthful and candid as possible. And now that matters, especially if we're living in a society where we need to have that sense of trust when it comes to gaining reliable information. If anything, this pandemic has shown us what a collective action problem we're facing. He really insists that we need to have this kind of trustworthiness as a base, a faith in our fellow members of society. And that's why the ship owner example, where the ship owner turns away from that evidence or tries to stifle his own doubts for a private pleasure, as Clifford might put it. That really matters because the ethics of belief for Clifford is something that's public and communal. And he always thinks that right and wrong are going to relate to the conscience in the community. So he thinks that there's this evolutionary account of the conscience too, that Darwin had given, and I believe it was The Descent of Man, where conscience is going to have this sort of voice, as we sometimes speak of it, where it's going to be this tribal or communal self. Now, this interests me, of course, Matt, because my work on Peirce has to do with the community of inquirers, community of investigators, or community of philosophers, right? As opposed to a kind of epistemic individualism, which I don't think is viable to making intellectual progress, if not ethical progress. Right.
Yeah. So Clifford establishes a fairly I suppose we could call it a strong principle, right? What he says is it is wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything on insufficient evidence.
That's correct.
Now, one of the questions I have, now this relates to issues that philosophers of science are tackling in a contemporary setting, which is the idea of inductive risk. And I'm curious about how this fits into the concept of Clifford's principle, particularly as it relates to the idea of what constitutes sufficient evidence.
Good.
Right. So if we were to consider the ship example again, where it's not merely that the ship owner sort of convinces himself the ship is seaworthy because he doesn't want to lose out on his shipment or a contract or something like that, but what if the cargo is like humanitarian aid,
Mm-hmm.
you know what I mean, and it's desperately needed, and so the question is still, is the ship seaworthy? Except now you have an issue where there are negative consequences for being wrong on both sides. If the ship is seaworthy and you're wrong about that, or if the ship is not seaworthy and you're not and you're wrong about that, then bad things can happen. And so, in inductive risk situations, there is this question about, well, how much evidence should be sufficient given the possible downsides of being wrong? Of course, obviously, this fits in with the larger community, right? Because these are larger social consequences of being wrong. You know what I mean? Like if you're wrong about the ship being seaworthy, and you say it's not seaworthy, but it is, and it's got all this humanitarian aid, well, then those people don't get that aid, right? It affects the community at large. It's a social, moral stake.
Yes. I think that's right, and you put it in a good way. I mean, this really provokes thought, doesn't it? At the same time, I mean, when it comes to this sort of inductive risk we would want to make sure that the vital supplies aboard that ship can safely make their way to wherever they need to make their way to. Now, I think what you're describing is a kind of urgent or emergency situation, right? Where it seems like that's why we need to take those risks. But at the same time, we would want to make sure that we don't take reckless risks or this sort of thing, especially if those vital supplies are aboard that ship. We would want to consult, say, expert authorities on this. And Clifford does have a section that's devoted to expert authorities and how we can put our trust in them, right? And again, it's placing one's trust in others that I think does matter, especially circling back to the ship owner example and this need for members of society to do things within the spirit of good faith, right? And
so is it a matter of earnestness then, or is it a matter of because again you could adopt different standards of evidence, right? When we talk about a statistically significant claim, for example, we might adopt different standards of evidence, like I need to be 90% confident or 99% sure, right? Yes. But in other cases, we may adopt a lower standard. We may say we only need 80% confidence or something like that. So does the sufficiency of evidence then, is that just a matter for experts to determine, or is there something else that needs to be involved? Because again,
No,
not
these
to
are good
jump that.
questions. These are good questions, Matt. I really do think so. But can I just address a few little points before we dig
Oh,
right into
sure,
them?
yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things here is this is not to correct you because you're right that people talk about what you described as Clifford's principle, as his principle, right? Is his evidentialist principle. But principle suggests that it's something that's primary or a starting place, when in fact, if you look at the text, he articulates that statement at the very end of the section called the duty of inquiry. And a lot comes before that statement, which is quite relevant to it. It bears on it. Um, and so I almost look at it as a kind of conclusion or concluding statement of that first section, the duty of inquiry. But that's just one sort of exegetical point that we don't need to make too much of, but it's just something to know, is that he doesn't actually start from there. There's a lot that goes into it, including those examples, one of them being the ship owner that he begins with. But another thing that has to do with induction that I think is quite relevant here is what he calls this assumption about the uniformity of nature. And what he wants to say there is that we make incremental progress. And the incremental progress comes from testing and investigating things further. There's very much a pragmatic aspect to this. So he talks about, say, a rock, and we can start with the rock as a simple example. The rock is going to have a place, it's going to be there at a certain time, it's going to have certain properties. And the question is, what kind of circumstances are going to allow us to understand more things about the rock, even from a geological perspective or a mineralogical perspective, right? It doesn't seem that the weight of that rock, for example, will be affected from the place where it's at, unless you take into consideration these things that have to do with latitude and longitude and like little slight variations that would affect its measurement. But what Clifford wants to say is that there's this uniformity in nature that we're going to discover, and we're going to discover that through our investigations and our other methods. Now that relates to the points you're making about induction, and you're sort of focusing on sufficiency of evidence, and I think that's really important too. But just if I can say one more thing.
I just want to tease it. Sure. I mean, I'm not trying to challenge Clifford. I think really what I'm just trying to do is tease apart what sufficiency means.
So here's where I wanted to turn, because there's two phases of this, right? Where you could talk about recognizing that you have insufficient evidence, right? Insufficient is going to be key here. And that's what he wants to illustrate with the ship owner. The ship owner realizes there are cracks in the hull, realizes that the ship was not well built, realizes that if you were to keep putting a ship on these voyages, it would get weather beaten and be liable to sink. And Clifford, of course, experienced this himself when he was in a shipwreck, right? And he's writing at a time when there were the so-called coffin ships. And the coffin ships were ones where people would send them out on voyages deliberately so that they would encounter disaster and sink, and then reap the insurance money of those. So he's tackling a problem that is really there during his time. But I want to point out that sort of recognition of that we have insufficient evidence, or we have doubts, creeping doubts, or melancholy reflections. These maybe pangs of conscience, right? Where we're wrestling with our conscience. We're hearing maybe even this sort of internal voice that tells us, oh, we'd be doing something wrong if we were to believe in something that's opposed to the evidence in front of us, or the evidence we don't have, or the insufficiency that we find.
Sure. So, but then where?
Right.
So who is the arbiter? Like who gets to say what is sufficient? You see,
right.
what I'm thinking of an example. Like even think of the what is this, the AstraZeneca vaccine, and they're worried about it causing blood clots, right? And so there's the question of there where you say, well, people under 30 or 40 or whatever shouldn't get or they may be at risk because of blood clots. So do you recommend, if I'm an expert and I say, yeah, go out and get the vaccine, how do I determine whether my evidence is sufficient? if I might be wrong, right? Because ultimately, if we're good Peirceans, right, maybe eventually we'll all agree one day, we'll all coalesce around an answer. But if we're not there yet, what is sufficient evidence?
This is a very good question, but I would want to ask: sufficient for what? Is it that the vaccine, in this case, the AstraZeneca one, isn't going to cause blood clots, and we're worried about those blood clots, or is it that it's going to, say, make us impervious to COVID-19, right, or the coronavirus? Not coming down with COVID-19, I should say. If we get into these finer points, I think that does matter. But you're right. I mean, there are these urgent situations where, we start asking ourselves, well, who do we trust, and do we have sufficient evidence at this moment? It's a really difficult question to tackle. The reason I brought up Clifford's notion of the uniformity of nature is because it shows that he has this dynamic view where you make incremental progress. And he knows that science is not in the state now, or even then when he was writing, that it could give us any definitive answers. Rather, we actually reach a state of belief where we don't have seemingly any real doubts about it. It's actually quite Peircean in that way. Clifford, after all, if you recall at the very end of that paper, he gives the example of fire burns, and that fire would burn a child, or it would burn anyone. But he talks about the example, and it's quite graphic, I know, but of a burnt child, or a child that's been in a fire, and of course that child is going to fear the presence of fire and know that fire will burn. But we're in a situation akin to that, where we know that fire will burn too. It's just, we might not be afraid of fire to the degree that a burnt child would be. But nonetheless, we don't have any real doubts about it. Now that might be what we reach at the end of inquiry, or when science has delivered its verdict.
So it sounds like sufficiency should then be sort of understood through the lens of method and experimental method. Mm-hmm. Because even if you're you are a vaccine expert and you have been asked if one of the vaccines is safe or not, and you may not know that for sure, but you can give for the expert, the sufficiency of the belief is tied to the methodology which has led to the conclusions so far. Mm-hmm. And perhaps if we qualify what we state in light of that, then perhaps it's that sort of colors how we understand sufficiency in that situation. Mm-hmm. Does that?
I think though that you and I would concede this, wouldn't we? That maybe we just don't have a large enough sample size or enough time to figure out whether or not those vaccines are as safe as, say, other vaccines that we have, right?
Sure.
I mean, yeah. And so there is a real concern about that, but now there might be a trade-off about whether or not by refraining from taking that vaccine, we put ourselves at risk of catching this virus and then spreading it throughout our society. And that really is quite a great risk that we'd be taking, particularly because you've noted other things besides mortality that matter, such as blood clots, right? And I certainly don't want to encounter any blood clots. I think you're raising some difficult questions, which I'm trying to probe in this paper that I'm writing, and so I definitely have found this helpful.
I mean, I mean, I'm not trying to object to.
No, we're trying to figure things out.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, it's an interesting idea because, if Dr. Fauci says something on the news, should Americans believe it? Should they not believe it? There's this struggle about what they believe, and there's been a lot of doubt that's been created because of the, even the issue of masks. Should you wear a mask? Should you not wear a mask? Originally, they said you shouldn't wear a mask because you'd be more likely to touch your face.
Right.
And now they've learned more things about how COVID spreads and how COVID works. So now they say wear a mask, right? So that's a case where the experimental method has led to a refinement of our thinking based on what we now know, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the sufficiency of the claim at the time, before we knew that, right? Like, is it
Mm-hmm.
sufficient to say that you shouldn't wear a mask? It's an interesting idea.
But
Um,
here's what could clog or cramp a refinement of those ideas in the progress of science, right? It's if someone were to go against what they consider to be good evidence pointing in the other direction, or realize that they don't have enough evidence for their belief, but they want to believe anyway for personal gain or some private pleasure or something like this, right? You can imagine certain scientists, particularly during the rise of science, that come up with hoaxes in order to fool the public, or someone tries to come up with a vaccine that doesn't actually work, and it could be for personal gain or whatever it may be. But that belief then cramps or stifles the sort of progress that we'd be able to make otherwise. And it also erodes the trust that we would have in one another. And that matters a lot for Clifford.
and for creating any kind of coherent epistemic community.
Nice. So yes, the conditions of that, right, for both this epistemic community, but also, one that's ethical too and concerned with the community. Now, if I can boomerang back to what originally sparked some of this paper, The Ethics of Belief, it's that Huxley in the Metaphysical Society had given this address to them just prior to Clifford, in the same year actually, 1876, on the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ, that is, and whether or not there was sufficient evidence for it, right? Or whether the evidence would be found to be insufficient and a belief in it would therefore be wrong. And he argued that actually it's not just an intellectual failing, but it would be a moral failing to encourage this belief because of, everything else that could come with a belief in that, as we probably know. But, Huxley had said, well, look, at the time of Christ, a lot of people didn't know that there's a difference between what's called a somatic death and what's called molecular death. Somatic death is one where there just aren't vital signs, but yet the vital organs are still intact. And this sometimes happens, actually. He mentions a case in India where it happens. There's cases of it with so-called zombies, if you know about this, in the Caribbean, where people have been given the venom or poison of a pufferfish, and it shuts down these vital signs for a while, but then they're able to recover from this. And people think that this is miraculous, and they think it's a miracle. But if we know about these cases, and we know that physiologically and medically that this phenomenon exists, then we would have to rule that out, right? In order to say that something like the resurrection of Christ was this miracle, where you might say that the laws of nature have been suspended, or that you could have faith in it, where faith might mean the absence, or even in the face of countervailing evidence, you'd still believe. Huxley was, again, an agnostic, and he had presented this paper just prior to Clifford's The Ethics of Belief. And the reason this matters is because he says it's not just an intellectual failing, but a moral failing also, where now we don't seem to be able to trust one another if we don't do what's considered to be this kind of vigorous investigation into these matters, and even consult those who would be, say, physicians, who could tell you that indeed these phenomena exist and we'd need to rule them out before we declare a miracle.
So it seems like what you're suggesting is that, it's not, Clifford isn't really interested in the question of sufficient evidence per se. I mean, obviously that's an important question, right? But
It is.
he seems, the thrust of the paper is essentially an argument against believing something without any sufficient evidence.
Or insufficient evidence upon insufficient evidence, right? Like, even if you recall, I was calling it a concluding statement, but we can call it Clifford's evidentialist principle. But if you read it again, what was it? It is wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe upon insufficient evidence. Isn't that how it goes? I'm going by memory
Sure.
here, Matt.
Yeah, but I mean, it seems like the central thrust seems to be, like Clifford has in mind the wishful thinker, the person who wants to believe something for essentially no good reason.
Good, yeah.
As opposed to believing something for little reason, even though you're more concerned about the risk of being wrong. So maybe Clifford isn't really addressing that at all.
Can you just repeat the last part? I wasn't sure if I caught what you said there.
Well, I wonder if Peirce is more, or sorry, not Peirce. Clifford is more interested in, his target is more the person who wants to believe something for no reason. And of course, this is where he comes into conflict with James, because James tries to find some reason to some occasion where it is okay to believe something without without any sort of sufficient reason, or without sufficient reason. But Clifford seems to be more focused on the person who wants to believe something essentially for no good reason.
Okay, yes. I would agree with some of this. I mean, there is a distinction to be drawn between believing in the absence of evidence and believing despite evidence, right? However, I think you're right that Clifford is concerned about this wishful thinker, because his model here is one where that would be a kind of private, stolen pleasure or private interest as opposed to a public one. And remember that he talks about how if we were to believe something without any evidence for it, let's say we're the wishful thinker or someone who's just too rosy in their thinking, we might end up becoming credulous. And so there can be this sort of slide from thinking that this is a one-off case, but then eroding our powers to investigate things, right? And maybe eroding our critical thinking as well. But that slides us down this slope where we could become credulous in our thinking and believe, nearly anything that we're given, or become gullible or naive. And then we pass that on maybe to the next generation. He's worried about this, right? That this could be generational, and successive generations do this. So we might not be able to recognize whether or not someone lied about something or believed something upon some wishful thinking, right? Because it might be that it's not going to be easy to go back and investigate the matter. But if that happens, then we're almost betraying the next generation of thinkers and also eroding our powers of inquiry. And so we're violating that duty of inquiry, as he says. That's how I take him to be reasoning about these matters.
It does make you wonder. I mean, the fact is that, if we're not, even if you're just thinking about this in terms of critical thinking, if you don't practice at it, you're going to get worse at it. You know what I mean?
Right. Particularly if you have these bad practices, which, you've somehow convinced yourself to stop this critical thinking because of your own personal pleasure or one's own personal pleasure, right? And one's own private stolen pleasure, as Clifford might put it. And I agree. I mean, he's encountering charlatans as well during his time. And they're trying to make a buck off other people and do so illegitimately.
Okay. Sorry, go ahead.
I wanted to follow up. So would you condemn the ship owner and condemn the ship owner in the way that Clifford does, right?
I mean, in the way that Clifford does. I mean, it's easy to say that if the person who's only sort of worried about his own bottom line and sort of convinces himself that the ship is seaworthy despite the fact that it's clearly obviously not. I mean, obviously in a case like that, it's easy to say that the person has acted on insufficient evidence. But I mean, the question then becomes, if you're going to say, well, you can't believe or you shouldn't believe anything on insufficient evidence, well, then a lot of a lot of what follows is going to depend on how we understand sufficiency. And I think, and I think part of what I wonder about people like Clifford is whether he's thinking about this in all possible contexts. Like, is it a universal standard that applies to every situation, or does the sufficiency and standards, do they change and alter depending on it? And maybe, are there some cases where we might decide to do something based on very little evidence because we're more worried about what we might do if we're wrong?
Yeah, so the cases that he brings up are ones where you might think of like a vital or noble lie that you would tell others who might not be in a position to properly, say, investigate these matters or come to the right conclusion. He's thinking about, say, the erosion of religion, and even now people will think that, oh, in order to be ethical, you must be religious. And he's clearly going against this and doesn't think that by telling people a half-truth or telling them what just is a lie, a gentle lie, maybe we might characterize it, is something that's good. He thinks that that shows a kind of craven crookedness, to use his term, and that rather we want to, say, yell the truth from the top of the tower, right? And it's something that each person would need to confront. He thinks that there's something really important about veracity and intellectual honesty that relates to ethics. And I tend to agree with him insofar as he outlines that.
Can I? Yeah. I mean, eventually I want to talk about how to make our ideas clear, but I think I do have one final sort of question, which is, so Clifford establishes a fairly universal claim, right? That it's always wrong to believe something without sufficient or to believe something with insufficient evidence, right? So it's a fairly universal claim. And James, in his Will to Believe, comes along and kind of says, there are a few occasions, even though James is largely sort of sympathetic to Clifford in terms of what his central point is, right? But James kind of says, well, there are some occasions, there are some exceptions to that rule. Based on the kind of research that you're doing, do you feel like you're inclined to accept that maybe there are some occasions, as James would suggest, or do you think that Clifford is just right, that it's just always, it is literally always the case that you have to have sufficient evidence to ethically believe something?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't arrived at a conclusion yet, and I'm still researching it and thinking more about it. I wanted to put more of the spotlight on believing upon insufficient evidence, right? Because I think Clifford really holds that when it comes to right and wrong, these things are rather obvious. And he does actually say things like that. Now, that might not, satisfy you when it comes to some of these much harder cases, or even when it comes to James, who wrote, quite a while after Clifford had died, and Clifford didn't have a chance to respond to James, unfortunately. So I'm still thinking of these cases which have to do with a kind of urgency, right? James gives one where he talks about someone who is a mountaineer who climbs a mountain and goes on this alpine adventure and then finds that they're stuck in this situation where they have to leap over a chasm, right? And if they have confidence that they'll be able to leap over the chasm, that might give them a better chance. That might constitute a prudential reason rather than an evidential one. But of course, this depends too, right? Like going back to the example that you gave about the ship that is trying to transport vital supplies. If that ship needs to make a sort of treacherous voyage that no reasonable person thinks it could make, then I think we would have strong evidence not to send that ship out there. In the same way that if the chasm was, say, 30 meters wide, we're not going to expect the climber to be able to make that jump, and it might be simply suicide to do so. But, these are going to matter on the cases, of course. And I need to think about these things further, no doubt. I'm trying, as you can probably see, Matt, to understand what Clifford's central argument was and whether or not it squares with what some of the contemporary scholars are saying about it. Now, one thing that they say is that we should turn away from Clifford's evidentialism and turn instead towards a virtue-based account that Clifford seems to give, especially when I was talking about, say, the credulous character, where that would be a kind of viciousness, right? Where the credulous character is going to be liable to believe in things with almost no evidence or very little evidence. And they want to, the contemporary scholars that is, tend to want to shift the focus. Now, what I want to say is that Clifford's evidentialism actually supports his naturalistic account of virtue ethics. Because again, it's naturalistic because he wants to give this account of conscience that relates to Darwin's account, and also the community that relates to his scientific aspirations. And so I'm trying to see whether or not these things cohere, and whether or not contemporary scholars are right about this. This is why I'm sort of fixated on the letter of Clifford's writing right now. But the questions you ask, I think they're ones that are quite thought-provoking and ones that need to be further considered. And so I'm doing that, and I may get to it actually at the sort of end of this paper that I'm writing, where I can start to look at some of those evaluative considerations and questions.
So it seems like we're shifting to Peirce now. When I asked you to do this podcast, I asked you what you wanted to talk about, and you said you wanted to talk about how to make our ideas clear, right? By Charles Peirce, written in 1877 for Popular Science Monthly. As we were talking about before we started, Popular Science is a fairly old publication. It was actually 6 years old by the time that Peirce published this article. I think the first question I want to ask you about this, we've talked about this paper before. Why did you want to talk about this paper?
So, when you invited me to do this podcast, and I think it's going excellently, by the way, Matt, I'm really proud that you have invited me as a guest and have me on. You also wanted me to talk about some of the work that I was doing now, which is why we went into a kind of vast discussion into Clifford, which I really enjoyed too. But the reason for looking at Peirce's piece, How to Make Our Ideas Clear, is that I think it's one of two of his greatest, if not most influential articles, the other one being The Fixation of Belief. And that's the first one in this essay series. But it really gets to sort of the rudiments of his pragmatism, and what's called the pragmatic maxim is featured in it. But it's this question about, well, what do we mean? And when it comes to having any idea, what do we mean when we have that idea, or what does that idea mean, right? Now, it could be an idea, a sign, a representation, but we want to know what we mean so that we don't fall into confusion or fall into linguistic traps, metaphysical ones even. And I think the reason for focusing on this article is because it's such a nice stepping stone to so much of Peirce's work. Peirce does think that there are, problems with the way he presents his core sort of argument in How to Make Our Ideas Clear. He comes back to that. But I think the reason for focusing on it is because it's so essential to his project of pragmatism, which he continues to work out over the course of his life.
Okay.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, before we jump straight into the nitty-gritty of Peirce, because, I agree that this is probably one of the more fascinating articles that Peirce has written, that along with The Fixation of Belief. Mm-hmm. But before we jump straight into that, I want to ask you, how did you end up becoming interested in Peirce and Peirce's work? How did you end up becoming interested in pragmatism?
Right. So it started off about maybe 8 years ago when I took a course at the University of Waterloo with Shannon Day, who became my supervisor for my dissertation. And that course intrigued me so much. It still does, because I found Peirce to be very refreshing in that he offers an alternative to, say, some of the epistemological commitments that I'd made previously. So originally, before I took up this project of trying to understand Peirce and trying to study his work, I had been really interested in contemporary epistemology, especially, these questions about, well, what is the nature of knowledge? What do we need in order to have knowledge? Is it true belief and justification plus something else, or is it even a matter of belief? These sorts of questions. And at the time, I was working on what's called virtue epistemology. So that's where we're talking about certain character traits that might give one a better chance of gaining knowledge, and then knowledge could be even constituted by having certain traits, such as intellectual honesty, open-mindedness, this need for accuracy, truth-seeking, etc. And so by taking this course, I found that there was a whole different pattern that we could use when it comes to looking at intellectual matters or even questioning, right? So it's, for Peirce, there is this need for knowledge, or this search for knowledge that we have, but he comes at that in a way which I found enlightening. So he talks about the fixation of belief as the end of inquiry. Now, let me just take one step back so that we can understand this and unfold some of its intricacies. Normally, when we would ask a question, even on any intellectual matter, what are we searching for? We might say we're searching for the truth, right? But the nature of truth is rather puzzling, as you know. There's the correspondence theory, there's a coherence theory, deflationist theories, all sorts. And Peirce says, well, you get a diversity of opinion, if not conflicting opinions, on that question about what is the truth, or what is the nature of truth. But we have a better grasp, he thinks, of what the nature of belief is. And he says that at least one feature of a belief is that it will make us apt to act on it. It will prepare us to act on it. But it instills within us a kind of habit, or sometimes it's put as a disposition. So that if I believe, say, that the keys are in my pocket, my right pocket, I will go to reach for my right pocket when I need my keys. Right? The same as if I believe that fire burns, I'm going to be sort of careful around a fire and not stick my limbs in it, knowing that, if I did that, they would probably be destroyed. Now, what Peirce wants to say is that when we reach a belief, we reach this state of satisfaction, an intellectual satisfaction at that. And what he means is that you would reach a state that you would no longer have any doubts, any real doubts. And now that matters to the sort of project that he has. Because there's this belief-doubt account of inquiry. And if you want me to go on, I can sort of sketch some of the details of how he comes to this, and especially his opposition to the Cartesian spirit that seems to animate much of contemporary epistemology. Very briefly, Descartes wants to have a reconstruction of philosophy where he's able to undo or get rid of the prejudices he's held for so long, maybe even since childhood, and also withdraw his mind from the senses and to push doubt to its limit, a kind of methodological doubt, so that it would satisfy even the most extreme skeptics. And Peirce thinks that, in order for Descartes to sincerely pursue this project, he has to somehow try to unravel or eradicate those prejudices. But Peirce doesn't think that Descartes could do this from entertaining what are methodological doubts, right? Doubts such as maybe an evil demon is tricking me at this moment, and I'm not actually, having this podcast with you, but it's simply a product of the evil demons
It's
doing.
all a figment of your imagination.
Please don't trip me out here. Right? And so Peirce thinks that you would need these real doubts in order to actually shake those prejudices or beliefs, right? To get rid of those habits that the beliefs involve. And that leads him to reject this project that Descartes proposes. And it's one that, even John Dewey had talked about this, the quest for certainty, right? And that Descartes trying to achieve a kind of absolute certainty, as much as humanly possible, we might say.
And just for anyone who may be unfamiliar with pragmatism, so and this is kind of interesting because in the paper, Peirce talks about this, right? When he's talking about belief and doubt, he says, well, this is, typically these words are more associated with religious matters, but he's just talking about sort of ordinary belief and doubt, where belief is a state where you just sort of naturally are sort of prepared to act in the world, and doubt is that situation where you're not. You literally have no habit of action that would allow you to know what to do next.
That's right. And so it could be like a very pedestrian example. Say I'm at the grocery store and I'm at the checkout line buying my groceries, but I haven't formed a habit of whether I pay with my debit card, credit card, or cash, right? And it may be that I start having this moment of indecision and hesitancy about what I should pay with, which form of payment I should make. And Peirce would even consider that to be a doubt if we look at it with a kind of mental microscope, as he says, right? And he gives the example of, I think, a horse car and paying either with a nickel or some pennies.
five coppers.
Right. Different currency there. But the sort of intellectual currency, I think, is the same, where, we would be in this state of hesitancy. We haven't formed that habit. And so he's going to characterize belief and doubt quite broadly, more so than those grave matters that he talks about earlier. Yes, go ahead.
I think that that way of understanding belief and doubt is so important to understanding pragmatism.
It is.
Because if you don't understand that when Peirce or Dewey, whoever, is talking about doubt as a kind of situation where, maybe you're just not sure about how you want to pay a bill, right? Or pay my fare. Do I pay with cash? Do I pay with debit? Do I, what do I do? That's a kind of doubt, right? It's a kind of situation where you don't know how to proceed, right? And so you got to think about it. And if you don't quite grasp that, then you're not. It's if you don't quite grasp that, that's what the pragmatists are talking about when they talk about doubt, then you may be more liable to start confusing things.
That's right. It creates we're in the midst of a problem situation where we need to solve a problem, right? Or we need to try to, as Peirce might put it, escape a real doubt that we're having, the irritation of doubt. And he'll consider inquiry to be this struggle to escape or satisfy doubt. And he thinks that eventually we're going to, if we continue doing it successfully and investigating it successfully, reach a state of belief or settled opinion. And it could be one that, at the end of inquiry, the object of inquiry, that is, would be one of the settlement of opinion or the fixation of belief, or a state that is unassailable by real doubt. And now I think you make the crucial point that belief, that notion of belief, is so important, right? It's not just something that we entertain before our mind, or something that might have vividness in terms of, our perceptions of it. Rather, it goes back to the Scottish psychologist Alexander Bain, and what he says is belief. He characterizes belief as what someone is prepared to act upon, right? And Peirce actually thinks that Bain deserves to be considered a forerunner of pragmatism. Of course, Peirce will consider this, along with James, to be a new idea for some old ways of thinking, and talks about this river of pragmatism that includes everyone from Socrates, Aristotle, to Berkeley, Scotus, Duns Scotus, to Bain, including so many others, right? He sees pragmatism in a lot of figures.
I've heard Benjamin Franklin and all sorts of figures.
Sure, but to get to circle back to your point, I mean, you're absolutely right that this notion of belief is essential to understanding what pragmatism is, according to Peirce and according to others who are considered to be classical pragmatists, including James and Dewey.
There's this interesting thing that comes up in pragmatism, and I think maybe it might be worth talking about, which is the idea of paper doubts versus what Peirce calls feigned hesitancy, right? That there's a difference between it not actually doubting what you claim to doubt and sort of kind of pretending to doubt for the sake of scientific inquiry and for the sake of investigation. Right, because all the pragmatists talk about how, if you don't have a real doubt, then you're not really talking about anything in the world, right? Like you're worried about all kinds of things that are possibly just sort of imaginary, right? But science requires that sometimes we sort of force ourselves to be doubtful about things. So I'm just wondering if you can speak to perhaps the difference between feigned hesitancy for the sake of scientific inquiry and the idea of paper doubts as understood by Peirce.
Okay. So there's actually quite a bit there, right? Because Peirce is going to talk about feigned hesitancy later in terms of a kind of pragmatic imagination, something like that. And now this might not be the sort of irritation of doubt, what you get with what you might consider genuine or real doubts. It's rather you're to imagine what you would do in a certain scenario or set of circumstances. And oftentimes a pragmatist is going to try to contract a habit or a rule of action. Peirce gives the example of his brother, actually, who reacts to his mother's dress being caught on fire. And his brother, I think it might be Herbert, who immediately grabs a mat and then, snuffs out the fire on the mother's dress, thereby averting this obviously, very bad situation. And there the Peirce asks his brother, how did you do that? How did you react so quickly? And he says, well, I had been imagining what I would do if this scenario were to occur, and I had contracted this sort of habit. Now, Peirce thinks that the imagination here is one that can allow us to contract this habit. It's a kind of feigned hesitancy, right? And feigned maybe for the sake of thinking of future events that would call for certain habits. Now, is that a paper doubt? I don't see that as being, quite in accord with what Peirce says about the nature of doubt having this kind of irritation in the same way. But I'm trying to catch my thoughts on this because it's not an easy question to answer that you pose. It's actually one that scholars have taken different stances on. How do you see it, Matt? Do you see this as being a matter of paper doubts when it comes to feigned hesitancy? And if it is, then that does go against what Peirce says, because when he talks about paper doubts, right, he means that there's like no weight behind them, that they really are something that might be a product of fictions and that seemingly don't have this irritation either. But I'd want to hear your thoughts, and I'll try to maybe catch up with my own.
I mean, I think we always have to remember that doubt and, we're talking about doubt. We're also talking essentially about belief, and belief is always going to be attached to, action in the world. And so the question is, when we, when we're dealing with a paper doubt, is there any actual reason at all to think that this could actually affect anything in the world? So in the case of, for example, Descartes, where there's the doubt that is created by the possibility of an evil demon who might be deceiving you, and that's a little bit different from a scientist who tries to sort of question whether he fully comprehends like how atoms work. You know what I mean? Like like the possibility that you could, um, misunderstand something and uh, would therefore um, would engage in the kind of experimental practices that would allow you to investigate some question. Like I think all that is driven by things that seem slightly more um, realistic and likely to affect action versus things that are just sort of um, purely imaginary and are sort of based on nothing.
Right. So if there weren't going to be any difference in conceivable effects, you might say, well, then it appears that the difference between those ideas is meaningless. At least at
Well,
this sort.
it's tough to say, I suppose, because I mean, if the evil demon is real, then that probably would have a conceivable effect, right?
Mhm.
I mean, presumably, if you're able to verify that, then you would know that, for example, nothing of what you thought you believed was actually correct at all, because you've been able to determine that it's all an illusion.
Right. But now,
But
if
I
it's
think
something that goes beyond any possible investigation or any possible inquiry, right, this really does call in question whether or not this is a legitimate hypothesis, whether or not it's going to have any sort of conceptual meaning for us.
is it well, would it be the kind of thing that would stop you from acting in the world? I think. Because I mean, I'm not sure if this is the way Peirce might put it, but I mean, the thing about the Descartes demon example is that even if Descartes were right and there was a demon sort of um, fooling you about everything, I'm not really sure if you'd be able to escape that anyways.
Hmm.
You know what I mean? Like you live in the world, you just kind of have to act in the world, regardless.
Perhaps to gain some traction here, we could go with Peirce's example now. It's one that rather seems a bit arcane, I know, but it has to do with whether or not um, ordinary bread could be blessed by a priest and changed into the body of Christ, or that
Sure. Yeah.
wine, right, table wine, could be blessed and transformed into the blood of Christ. This doctrine of transubstantiation, um, according to Catholics, I believe. Um, and so, just imagine we don't know whether or not that wine's been blessed, and to both of us, it seems like ordinary table wine. We might say, "Oh, that's a Pinot Noir," if we're, sommeliers even, or if we know a lot about wine.
If we're
Um,
the fancy wine drinking types.
sure, right? Um, but then, if it turns out that there aren't any conceivable differences, effects, or even differences in our expectations after investigating both those samples of wine after innumerable investigations, it's not clear to me that there's a practical difference there, that there's a meaningful one, right? Because remember, if it's going to be blood, there's going to be hemoglobin in it, or white blood cells, or whatever else. But if none of that is detectable in the table wine, what use is there calling it blood? And can we actually sort of coherently, from a conceptual point of view, say that that is blood, given that it's so divorced from what's familiar to us when it comes to blood, right? When Peirce is working out how to make our ideas clear and trying to come up with these techniques, he'll start with certain grades of clarity. The first one being a kind of familiarity, where we don't have any hesitancy about the matter, right? I mean, I don't think we'd have any hesitancy in determining whether something in a normal situation like that would be wine. We likely wouldn't come to the conclusion immediately that it's blood. Um, but then there's this next grade, which is definition, right? And how we would define blood, how we would define wine. And then the third grade, which is this pragmatic grade of clarity with the pragmatic maxim, where we're to look to these conceivable effects. And if those conceivable effects are no different, it's not obvious to me how there's any sort of difference between them, right? We would need to make our ideas clear by investigating these matters as much as we could. And if we sort of try to stipulate that something is beyond all investigation and all possible investigation, we seem to hit a pragmatic wall there, right? And And so it might be that that's the kind of way of responding to both this evil demon supposed hypothesis or possibility and the possibility of transubstantiation.
Sure. So it's kind of interesting at rereading How to Make Our Ideas Clear. Obviously, I've read it before, but in rereading it now, it's kind of interesting because you see Peirce. He sort of talks about these issues of doubt and belief, and the idea of adding a third grade of clearness that goes beyond mere abstract definition, right, which is your second grade. And then your first grade of clearness, which is familiarity, right? You always sort of know it when you see it, kind of thing. And Peirce is critical of the first because he says, you can, and that's just a subjective thing. Anyone can sort of claim that something is very clear to them, and it may not be. And then you have the second grade, which is, well, can we provide some sort of abstract definition? And then to that he says, well, we never learn anything new by simply analyzing definitions, right? And so then he comes to this third grade of clearness, right, which is sort of him, how he eventually sets up the formulation of the pragmatic maxim, right? So he says, all right, well, we aim to create belief, and beliefs are about enabling habits, and habits are stimulated by what we perceive, and we sort of act in order to achieve some sort of sensible result. And this is how he ties the idea of the third grade of clearness into the idea of action. Now, for some Peirce scholars, they sort of take Peirce and read Peirce as simply kind of, essentially, you can almost sort of read it as adding just a sort of an empirical element on top of Descartes. You know what I mean? Like if you weren't a Peirce scholar and you were just reading this and you see Peirce sort of talking about how, if we're trying to get clear about what a concept is, it's great to having an abstract definition, but there has to be some sort of empirical, sensible connection to whatever it is we're talking about. But Peirce, and for some Peirce scholars, like they believe that, whereas for other Peirce scholars, they seem to think that he means something more. And so I think what I want to maybe hear from you about is, what do you think Peirce actually takes to mean by the practical? Like, is it just the sensible results? And in which case is Peirce doing anything different from, for example, the logical empiricists? Or is there something more to action that Peirce means beyond mere sense?
Right. I mean, the word sensible there can be misleading, right? Because he'll talk about experiential too, right? Experiential results or conceivable ones. Something that's going to relate to the mind, particularly because he has this view about concepts explaining concepts or ideas explaining ideas and not trying to break free of that. But there's a kind of, as he puts it later, rational or intellectual purport to these concepts. So we refine them, right? Even in our concept or idea of blood, we've refined it over these years. I mean, water would be another good example, right? With H2O and understanding the properties of it. But we could do the same thing with wine. Now, when it comes to the practical, I think we need to maybe go back a bit and think of the kind of model that Peirce is adopting when it comes to the fixation of belief too. Because he wants to relate this kind of pragmatic insight that he reaches with this third grade of clarity to the method of scientific investigation too, right? And then we can start talking about the practical in those terms, in terms of community of scientists or community of inquirers who are accumulating information about the world.
The question that interests me about Peirce, because I'm not a Peirce scholar myself, but I've read Peirce. I've studied pragmatism, and I think part of the issue I have with Peirce, and the question I'm always trying to sort of get from him is sort of when we're talking about action, are we just talking about the sensible results? Because there are times when he sort of writes as if that's all he's talking about. If for example, if we're talking about blood, the sensible results of what we might expect for how we identify blood is probably changed from 1878, right? The way we would identify blood today probably depends less upon like the color of the liquid or the viscosity of it or something like that, and more about what it looks like under a microscope and the sort of physical properties of what blood is and what blood does. Those would be tied to how we would identify blood today, right? But you can talk about that purely in terms of the sensory qualities that you would expect. But when we're talking about action, action isn't just about what we see, it's about what our aims are. And so I think one of the questions I've always had about Peirce is does it matter what the question is? I.e., does it matter what the question is in terms of what the answer is? Because if people can ask different questions of reality and sometimes get different results. Peirce talks about this when he talks about the idea of a cheerful hope that, if we push the process of investigation to find a single solution to each question. Now, of course, the question might be different. I might ask different questions about a certain property compared to a scientist in a different field who might ask certain questions about that property. And so the question, therefore, I think I'm trying to get at is, for Peirce, does it matter what the question is, or should any possible community always come to the same result, or does it matter what our aims are?
I think it does. So let me see if this helps. So when we're trying to, say, explain some surprising phenomenon, right? Maybe it is that you and I go out on an adventure and we see that there are all these fossils, and they look to be marine fossils, but we're on dry land, and we're wondering, well, how did this come to be, right? And we know that there isn't any water around us, at least not now, and we keep rummaging through the soil, say, and we see more and more fossils, and we wonder first maybe whether someone planted them there or just disposed of a bunch of marine fossils, say, on that land site. But we might also come up with another hypothesis, right, after thinking about this a little further, and think whether or not at one time that piece of land that we're standing on was covered by a body of water, and that there were all sorts of marine life there, and that marine life had died and left these fossils there. And then we have a hypothesis, right, which for Peirce is so important about the creation of hypotheses. And that has a real practical component too, but it's not one that just translates into immediate action or one that's just actions of the moment. There's a kind of creativity involved in coming up with a hypothesis that's explanatory, or as we might say, adequate, or something that would tell us why that phenomenon is there. And so I think we would really need to add this point about hypothesis and the generation of hypotheses. And just to use a bit of jargon here, Peirce will call this abduction, which nowadays is normally considered to be inference to the best explanation. But for Peirce, he's not really sure whether it's going to be the best. It's just a matter of coming up with a hypothesis that could be tested further. But coming up with that hypothesis is actually a creative process. And it's not one that just relates to, say, the stereotype that you and I, Matt, probably encounter as pragmatists or pragmatic thinkers, which is that pragmatism just is about what's expedient in the moment, or what's about action, or even it's got a sort of worse connotation, right, in politics when they ask what's pragmatic, and think that you just do whatever will give you the results that you want.
Can I ask you personally? Now, Peirce seems to think that, he says this, that that we have to have this cheerful hope, and that, even if it seems like we're not going to find an answer, in the far future we may come up with something, right? We have to sort of think that way, and he talks about historical secrets of the past that may have been buried and we may not find again. And he sort of says we have to have this kind of cheerful hope. Now, the interesting thing is that historically, in terms of inquiry, he's not necessarily wrong. Like I was reading not that long ago about the Bronze Age collapse, and how, recent studies have been able to demonstrate that possibly the reason for the Bronze Age collapse is because of environmental disasters, which they've been able to potentially corroborate by finding pollen samples from the time and investigating those. And I'm sure at the time of when Peirce was writing, that would have seemed fantastical, but to us, we've been able to do it. So should we really have the kind of faith that Peirce has or seems to have, or should we be a bit more skeptical about his optimism?
Well, let's look at the flip side of that question, right? You're asking me whether we should have this cheerful hope or maybe even investor confidence in it. But with Peirce, he'll talk about how we may be liable to block the road of inquiry, right? By making certain assumptions, or we say, we'll never be able to discover that. Or, well, that's going to be just beyond our ken or our grasp. And he thinks that this is an illegitimate move because, again, that might be putting forth a hypothesis that just is trying to give you something that you could never explain, right? The inexplicable, something that would transcend all minds. And he thinks that that's an unwarranted assumption, and actually one that he finds to be cognitively meaningless. So remember, he gives in How to Make Our Ideas Clear that one example of Auguste Comte, the positivist, who says that we will never be able to find out, I don't know if it's some properties about the sun, right? Perhaps, understanding the composition of the sun, the material composition of it, or some other matter. And then Peirce says, well, no sooner than the ink dried on his page that they were able to make discoveries through the spectroscope, I think it was. Peirce was really interested in the sun and solar phenomenon and eclipse and all that. So I want to look at it maybe from the other side, right? Not so much this cheerful hope, this confidence that if we keep marching on, if we were to do that and keep doing it in the long run, we would, eventually reach the fixation of belief or the settlement of opinion. But rather, if we make certain assumptions, let's say, block that road to inquiry, then they can actually end up stifling investigation. Maybe in the case you're talking about with this clothing that they found, or polymers, was it?
No, pollen.
Pollen, okay. So that discovery wouldn't be made if some, say, archaeologist or historian said, well, that's just going to be completely beyond us and we'll never get there. I mean, that can, create a barricade towards inquiry. And we've seen that happen before.
It's kind of a tricky question, because on the one hand, it's very easy to say something like, there are lots of questions for which we didn't think we would have an answer, but now scientific progress has now allowed us to test and find things and to pull things from the earth and to check it and to turn it over and look at it and investigate it, right? Even the secrets of the universe, even with the efforts now that are being put into mining asteroids and stuff like that, I'm sure in the coming decades we'll find out all kinds of things about the universe that we probably didn't think we would ever know. But the question is whether we should always have that. And of course, it's better to adopt that habit, because, even prudently, because we don't want to block the path of inquiry. But if you're willing to say that there are certain things for which we may never know, then are there certain kinds of claims that just will never have a truth value? I think is the interesting. For me, it's one of the for my own philosophical interests, it's one of the interesting questions because you see all the pragmatists tackle this question.
Yeah, I think there's some things to be said for this, right? Again, Peirce is worried about the kind of rise of positivism there, that is saying that we need direct verification, right? That if something can't be directly verified, then it's meaningless. And we see at least a kind of form of this, and even the writings of the logical positivists later on, right? And they're grappling with how to articulate and clarify the verification principle. Peirce is going to allow maybe as wide a scope as there can be when it comes to verification. But he always wants to think that, if the question that we're asking is meaningful and legitimate, we have to be open to the possibility of it receiving an answer. I think that point is quite important here, but also this other one about reality again, right? He thinks that there's some external permanence, right? There's something that the world is like that doesn't just depend on what our minds think of it, and that it's causing us to have experiences, even sensory experiences, but that we don't want to say that whatever is real is completely outside of our minds or completely outside of the realm of any possible investigation, because he doesn't think that that could be a meaningful notion. Rather, it's that reality is going to relate to what we'd reach at the end of inquiry, at the end of our investigations. But again, this is so tricky because he's subtle here, right? He wants to say that our investigations are still going to have this external permanence. We're still going to have experiences. It's just, those experiences, again, if they're surprising us, they're going to shake our beliefs and lead probably to real doubt. They're going to stimulate and prompt inquiry further. And our beliefs are going to be fixed by this method of scientific investigation. I'm a bit loath to go into this, of course, because this relates to the fixation of belief, and I don't want to try to summarize that whole article, but it does relate to how to make our ideas clear, right? And Peirce is a thinker who always has these kind of interlocking aspects to his thought. He's aspiring to be systematic through and through, and it actually leads, at least for a researcher like me, to always have material and to always have things to look at. But for others, it might be a bit daunting. Nonetheless, I think those two things do relate to this point of discussion that we're having, especially when it comes to the rise of positivism during Peirce's time and how he sees this as blocking the road of inquiry, the way of inquiry, and also this view of reality that he wants us to see the relevance of, right? Because the other view of reality, and this relates to contemporary issues too, is that reality is just whatever is there and beyond our minds, say, and it could be beyond our minds ultimately, right? Beyond all our investigations, transcends our minds. And Peirce actually starts to think of this as the nominalistic view of reality that he wants to combat, because he sees it as cutting ourselves off from, even things like we talk about qualities or habits. And if you're to ask about, say, a law of gravitation or a law of nature, what kind of reality does that have? It doesn't seem like it would just be about one object causing another, or two billiard balls smashing together, or that it has to be, these individual particulars of the universe, like things, individual things, right? Because he wants to say that there really is a habit taking, or there really are laws or rules that are governing these behaviors. And this matters again to what he means by belief, right? That belief is going to be, at least involve a habit of action, I should say, right? It establishes within us some habit. So I know that's a lot, but there's a lot in Peirce too, right? And I want to give him a fair shake here.
it's a complicated issue. I think every pragmatist kind of struggles with this a little bit, trying to sort of fit a view of the world using language that is often sort of co-opted and used in other philosophies, and it creates a kind of confusion because it's very easy to kind of read Peirce and sometimes fall into the view that maybe he's just talking about some sort of correspondence view, but as you suggested, that's not really what he has in mind.
No, especially because I think it relates, at least in How to Make Our Ideas Clear, to this method of fixing belief through scientific investigation, right, or through the method of science. And that itself is a complex matter. Would you mind if I ask you a question, Matt? And
Sure.
it's a general one. What do you see as the most significant points of overlap between Peirce and Dewey? And what do you see as the most significant differences? Or difference, if I can put it in the singular there.
So I think, I mean, I don't know if I'm comfortable enough as a Peirce scholar, because Peirce has such a complicated system.
How about we stick with How to Make Our Ideas Clear in the fixation?
Sure. Well, we can confine. I mean, if we're just talking about how to make our ideas clear, I mean, it's kind of interesting because there are some parts of the paper that I read and I see areas where I think Dewey would probably disagree, but then there's so much. I mean, in terms of the belief doubt framework, the idea of trying to fixate belief through experimental action. I mean, I think the spirit of the paper is definitely in keeping with Dewey, but there are little issues or little areas where I think Dewey might be somewhat more resistant. Like it's interesting at the beginning of the paper, towards the beginning, when Peirce is talking about music in the air. Are you familiar with what the example I'm talking about? Yes. So Peirce starts talking about how we perceive the individual notes and how that's different from the air. But I think for Dewey it would be it's a sort of an inverse from the way that Peirce sort of describes it. For Dewey would probably say we're more likely to hear the music as music and then later on distinguish the individual notes. Mm-hmm. We don't perceive the individual notes. That's not how you perceive music. So for Dewey, it's more a matter of this sort of larger experience that we then make distinctions out of. But that being said, I mean, I think one of the interesting things about the concept of even firstness, if I recall correctly, the firstness is really where you do kind of, in a rough sense, bump into the world, right? That if you believe something about the if you believe something,
yeah.
Well, if you believe something about the world and you're wrong, you're at the level of firstness is where you're sort of going to bump into it, right? The world is going to sort of tell you that you're wrong, right? If you think that fire is not hot and you stick your hand in it, well, you're very quickly going to realize that you're wrong, because at a very sort of basic level, you're going to realize that there's going to be a shock to your system.
Yes. I mean, Peirce gives the other example of some movers who are kind of clumsy, and a walker who's preoccupied and gets hit in the head with a ladder, and you're pretty aware that there's something that is outside of just your mind. When you get hit in the head with a ladder, you're going to feel a reaction and have a response to it, and this is where there is a kind of secondness, right, which is an outward clash or external clash. I think, if I recall, the sort of firstness relates to qualities, and he gives like the example of someone who's asleep and all of a sudden is waking up, and maybe they have the color turquoise in mind, or the color scarlet or something like this, and then of course when they're awoken by the train whistle, the scream of a train whistle, they encounter this secondness because it's something that reaches this outward clash. And then thirdness is going to have to do with habits and regulation. And if you continue with this example of someone in bed who's beside this train tracks or something like this, they say close the door to their home, and all of a sudden the train whistle doesn't seem to start, but then they open it again, and it screams, and then they close it again and say it starts screaming again. They find that, closing and opening the door doesn't really turn on or off the train whistle. But if I recall the example correctly.
Sure. Yeah.
But
I mean,
there's really a sort of complexity here.
I think.
Go ahead.
So in terms of overlap between Peirce and Dewey, like I think to some extent that there's a large amount of overlap in terms of how they sort of conceive of experience. But I think, and this is part of the reason why I was asking you about this earlier, was for Dewey, I think it's always going to depend upon the question, right? Like Dewey takes Darwin very seriously, I think. He tends to sort of have this kind of basic Darwinist sort of framework in mind when he's talking about inquiry, where, any organism is always just trying to adapt to its environment. And so the kinds of questions that we ask are always going to depend upon those kinds of interactions. So when we find something doubtful, it's doubtful in a context. We're doubtful because we're not sure how to proceed now. And so, the question is always going to be, what is my aim? What am I trying to accomplish when I formulate a question or propose a hypothesis or propose some protocol that would allow me to test my theory? It's always going to be governed by the local situation of doubt. And so if I come up with some sort of question and I go talk to someone else about it and they start questioning me, well, then we may go back and forth and we may sort of form some sort of a community of inquiry. But it's still going to depend upon the specific question in mind, as opposed to any possible question we might have about something. So I say this because I'm thinking of, like, there's a sort of notion, there's a sort of strain within Peirceans about the transhumanist strain, that we need to sort of, that if we're going to inquire to something, it has to be something that would be recognizable to any possible sort of life form who might inquire. Whereas I don't think Dewey would go that far.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a bit hesitant to go into this.
It's complicated, right?
Because, again, it probably relates to Peirce's theory of signs too, and he doesn't want to make what he considers to be sort of anthropological or psychologistic commitments, where that means that something like even logic needs to reduce to what the mind is like, or even phenomena for that matter.
Well, it's tricky because Dewey is very much a sort of not a behaviorist, but he's the kind of person who sees mind as a kind of a process. A mind is a kind of activity. We are mindful of things. You know what I mean? Like, mind is to be mindful of something is to sort of consider it and reflect on it and inquire about it and consider its relationships to other things, right? Like, he doesn't see mind as being a kind of ontologically different thing. You know what I mean? So for him, it's not. I suppose there's a sort of psychology, but it would be a psychology that it's applicable to almost all living beings. You know what I mean? In terms of just adaptation to an environment.
So I think here is one point where Peirce and Dewey would agree, right? Because Peirce reacts to this notion that you find in, say, the classical empiricists, which is that the mind is roughly maybe like a blank slate or a blank piece of paper, and it takes on impressions, and it's passive, right? It passively receives impressions. Whereas Peirce thinks of the mind as active, right? And that there's something inferential about even the perceptions that we're having. And so we bring something to our experience. It's not that we just passively receive it, right? We're just not receptors in that way.
Sure.
But this activity of the mind is really important. He thinks that all thinking is active, and even, thinking in terms of signs is going to be this active and generative, this generative, maybe mode of being is the way to put it. But yeah, okay.
I was just going to say, I think that's probably an area where they are probably very close, because Dewey'd be the last person to say, well, let's try to figure out what the world or what the universe looks like from the perspective of nobody.
Yeah, we're not just spectators, right?
Yeah. Well, this is what he calls the spectator theory of knowledge, and he's very critical of it. So, in that regard, I think Dewey and Peirce are probably largely on the same page.
I think so too. Can I ask you a question?
Sure, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so one question I have for you is, what do you see as the prospects or sort of broadening horizons for pragmatism, and how pragmatism relates to contemporary philosophy, and what sort of relationship should it have with contemporary philosophy? What do you think? I mean, I realize this question is rather tough, because we might ask, well, what sort of pragmatism do you mean, right? It's a kind of family concept.
Yeah.
Under that umbrella, there are variants. But if we're to even go with Dewey's version, or a Deweyan version of that, how do you see it as connecting, contrasting with contemporary philosophy, and what can it bring to the table, so to speak?
It's kind of funny, because you're right. I mean, of course, it's going to depend on what kind of pragmatism you adopt. And the interesting thing about Deweyan scholars is that they often tend to go into social work, or they tend to go into education, or they kind of they kind of often want to do anything but philosophy. You know what I mean? And Dewey himself was often he seemed to be a bit disheartened about how fixed philosophy tended to be. Right. Philosophy tends to be a profession that's very set in its ways about certain things. And I think it's kind of interesting, because you see both in How to Make Our Ideas Clear, where Peirce mentions how Descartes wanted to reconstruct philosophy, which is obviously what Dewey, he used that kind of slogan too. I mean, as a pragmatist, because I kind of wanted to ask you this question too. And I think the thing that all the pragmatists tend to coalesce around is the idea of the experimental method as being sort of paramount over a lot of. I don't want to necessarily dismiss all metaphysics, because, again, I mean, what we count as metaphysics, and what's good metaphysics and what's bad metaphysics is a kind of complicated question. But I think the idea of looking to experimental methods and experimental methodologies is probably where I would see the future of philosophy, looking at the scientific method, both as it applies to practicing scientists, but also to the way we operate in our normal everyday world. Like even the example of a COVID vaccine, right? A COVID vaccine one of the vaccines has a potential to create blood clots in people who are under a certain age, right? And so does pragmatism have anything to say to that person? And I think that it does. So I think there's a lot of things that pragmatism can add to today, but at the same time, there's this issue of how much does the profession want to change? So there's this complicated issue of what can pragmatism add to philosophy versus what can pragmatism add to the lives of people who are outside of philosophy. Mm-hmm. And it's a tricky question. I mean, for philosophers, what I would like to see, I mean, ultimately what I would like to see if there was some sort of reconstructed philosophy along a pragmatist line of thinking would be a real investigation into values. Because I honestly think that a lot of the way that many people understand values and what values are and how values influence our thinking are very much motivated by philosophers. You know, it's so common now to hear people talk about how values are all subjective, and I do wonder if a lot of this comes from certain kinds of philosophers from certain eras that may have been more influential than they may have realized.
Or possibly sophists too, um, who want to just say that it's all relative, right? And maybe that human beings are the ultimate measure of all things. Yeah, you make some good points there, especially with these sort of concrete situations and what a pragmatic philosophy or pragmatism could do to help resolve some of those. I mean, just thinking of COVID-19, there's many people who say that it's just a flu, right? And I'm not sure whether they mean that they're talking about the effects of it or whether they mean it's just a flu. And if they mean it's influenza, well, the pragmatists could start thinking about, are all the conceivable effects the same? Is influenza the same as a coronavirus? And you could start teasing apart that sort of misapprehension. Right? And people do fall under these misapprehensions, and pragmatism, of the Peirce stripe certainly tries to stop that from happening with how to make our ideas clear, figuring techniques that would do so, to make sure that we don't stumble into confusion.
Well, I mean, I think one of the more interesting things, even about the whole COVID sort of pandemic, has been the cases where it's been clear that certain habits of action just are better. You know what I mean? Like, it's better for you to wear a mask. It's better for you to get vaccinated. It's even though it may not necessarily be better for everyone all the time, ultimately it may be a better thing to engage in lockdowns and restrictions, because ultimately it prevents other things from happening, and we have evidence that can actually corroborate those kinds of claims. And I think that's one of the interesting things about the scientific method, as you sort of see it practiced in real life in front of our very eyes. Where a year ago we had this virus, and I remember when we first saw that the virus was airborne. When we learned that, right? That wasn't known before, and so all of our habits about how we interact and what we should do and not do, all that changed in light of that evidence. Right? Because you're either the kind of person who thinks that evidence should affect the way you act, or you aren't. And if you're the kind of person who thinks that values are completely subjective and what you ought to do is completely subjective, well, then evidence shouldn't really matter to anything you ever do. So
yeah, you're making me recall Clifford though here, with these considerations about evidence too. But I do agree with that point. I think one thing, with contemporary philosophers that kind of strikes me as in need of some further questions is something like metaphysics and this concept of reality that Peirce brings to the table, right? Which is not one that's so simple. It's not one where philosophers just say, well, there's got to be a reality outside of our minds, and it's like irrespective of what we think about it, and maybe absolutely transcends our minds. I think these are sort of dangerous assumptions at times, because they don't consider alternatives to those views, including a conception of reality that's going to relate to the end of inquiry, in the fixation of belief, right? Or whether we talk about truth and don't bring up these same pragmatic considerations again. I'm wondering too about how to approach contemporary philosophers who don't share these views, right? And have sort of really maybe hardened notions about how like reality is or truth is. Sorry, go ahead.
It's so funny because like for Dewey, right? I mean, Dewey, if you read a lot of his earlier work, he sort of talks about changing philosophy, and he talks about, people who are critical of Dewey's conception of logic, for instance, and they don't realize that like how contemporary philosophers understand logic and how philosophers at the turn of the century would have understand logic is a very different thing, right? And so, but for Dewey, I think he kind of realized later on in life that when he was trying to sort of reconstruct certain terms or try to use terms in a way that was sort of contrary to the sort of going philosophy at the time. He became much more willing to sort of just say, well, now I'm just talking about this. So the example I'm thinking of is truth, right? Earlier in his career, he was willing to talk about truth a lot more than he was later on. And later on, he was willing to sort of just say, well, I'm talking about warranted belief or warranted assertability. And it's almost like he kind of gave up in a way, where he was just sort of giving up on the project of trying to change philosophy, where he was just like, all right, this is just what I'm doing. This is just what I'm talking about. And I don't know if that's for other Deweyans, like I said, a lot of other Deweyans, they tend to not stay in philosophy. They tend to get into social work, or they try to get into education, or they try to get into, other sciences, because they're more interested in doing things in the world and changing it than just arguing about what truth is.
Yeah, I mean,
but of course, you and I find that issue fascinating, right?
Well, and I'm thinking back to Peirce, who's trying to give us a way to clarify what we mean by that concept of truth, right? And doing so through belief in the nature of belief, rather than, becoming so focused and confining ourselves to the nature of truth and just sort of having these squabbles over it at times. Is there a way to clarify it or to elucidate truth through this pragmatic notion of belief?
Well, I mean, if you think about it from a Peircean perspective, there's nothing more dangerous than saying something like, I understand and I know what an objective world is like. Like a completely objective world. Because if you claim to know something like that, then there really isn't any reason to ask any other questions, is there?
Right.
To say that you have done investigation, to say that you know how something works, is a bit different from saying something like, I have a claim for which I can claim the authority of a mind-independent reality.
I think this is a good question. Yeah, because I mean, even like someone like Peirce, he'll talk about this admission of ignorance, right? Or this willingness to learn. And there's a kind of fallibilism that I think resonates with a lot of people, actually. And that we need to learn these things we need to learn by our mistakes, of course, but also learning is going to be this incremental process, and we don't want to block the way of it. And so, sorry, go ahead.
I'm just wondering, do you think that fallibilism might be one of the more important things? I'm thinking about this in terms of our contemporary social context, but do you think that if we're philosophers and we're trying to, let's say, engage with the public as pragmatists, is fallibilism one of the more important things that we can preach, so to speak? The idea that anything is potentially revisable and that's okay.
So maybe this is about scientific literacy too, right? Because I mean, if you and I were to ask scientists about how they approach any sort of a problem or phenomenon, right? They're going to talk about the hypotheses that they hold, and that the knowledge that they think they have is going to be provisional, or whatever supposed discoveries they make are going to be provisional. Now, I think a lot of non-scientists, lay people, sometimes even suppose that, since scientists have a different view of this now, like even when it comes to, say, you were talking about in the context of viruses, right, and what we've learned with face masks or not wearing face masks. I mean, the knowledge that we supposedly gain there is going to be provisional or have a sort of tentative status. I think people might not realize that the reason we put our sort of faith in science is a scientific process and a scientific method, and it's that method or process by which we could gain, what we would call maybe in the end knowledge, or our most sort of informed views. We might even call it evidence-based.
It's interesting.
Yeah, okay.
Because it's interesting because again, just feeding on to the mask example, the politicians were have been able to say, well, you said we shouldn't wear masks before, and now you say we should. You've been wrong. Now you've been wrong again, and it's like, well, they were wrong, but that's not the point. The point is that they're revising because of the method, right?
Well, and they'll unfortunately, like some popular or everyday minds will just say, well, they're flip-flopping, right?
Yeah.
And now we can't trust them. But that's, I think, to mistake or to be mistaken about what the scientific method is or a scientific approach to things. And I think scientific literacy is something that's quite important, and that people might have a mistaken notion of what science is.
For a lot of people, the pandemic is kind of an eye-opener about both what science can do and what it can't do.
Yeah, there's questions too about the sort of science and disseminating information and the scientific like as a set of professionals or something like this, and trying to interact with the public, if not give them the information they need to make good decisions. There's that aspect to it, but again, like I would want to, at least in some points, bring it back to this idea of like the scientific approach, scientific method, and understanding what that is, and how we need to be fallibilists because of it, because we can't just sort of guarantee whatever discovery or results we reach.
Do you think that the concept of truth is kind of has it outlived its usefulness in the age of science?
So, I mean, if we're going to clarify truth in terms of reaching a state that's unassailable by doubt, I want to push all our real doubts to the limit, and whatever scientists bring up, right? Even, I mean, one of the things about science is that I may want the world to be, in a certain state or in a certain way, but like, despite my belief, it turns out that science delivers an opposite result or something that I might not like, but I might need to accept that. I mean, and if you're scientific, I mean, the sort of idea of this open-mindedness or admission of ignorance or willingness to learn, I think really factors into it.
So do you think that, so when I say truth, I'm not talking about necessarily I'm talking about truth as it's used and understood within a social context.
Mm-hmm.
So again, I mean, so many people tend to think that truth is just this kind of absolute claim that we're making about something, whereas for Peirce, I mean, there's the sort of ultimate truth that we'll arrive at the end of inquiry. But short of that, there are lots of things that we may call true today, but that we will revise or be willing to change tomorrow in light of new evidence.
Yes.
But for so many people, they don't. I think that's it's a step too far to get to that, because they say, well, you're saying something is true and now you're saying it's not.
Right.
And so the question is, should we call things true now, or should we just sort of say, well, this is our best guess, or this is our most warranted answer to this question?
Right, or something that we might have a strong belief in now, but can be shaken by real doubts later. And, I think if we approach it in this spirit of science, then we'll come to find that, we are going to have real doubts about many of the beliefs that we hold now. It's just, truth seems to be almost aspirational in some ways, but Peirce at least thinks he can clarify it through talking about the fixation of belief, right, or the nature of belief.
If we're talking about reconstruction of philosophy in a contemporary sense, I think we could probably start with not necessarily methods or anything like that, but to start with forums and the logistics of how we do philosophy, and mm-hmm. So, not everything has to be dictated by what goes into a journal,
No.
So the ability to open up the field and the ability to relate it back to issues that are more publicly relevant, I think is a helpful thing, and it's a good thing for the field in the long run. Even if you want to keep the journals, because there's this tendency, there's this risk that philosophy just keeps looking more and more inward.
Yes, and I mean, so what might push us outward is to remember that at least one starting place for philosophy is dialogue, right? A dialogue between fellow interlocutors who are trying to understand some question or wonder or doubt that they have. Going back to like these questions of the nature of justice, what is happiness, what is the good life? These are approached through dialogue often, and even that can benefit the sort of internal dialogue that we tend to have, right? When I'm, say, sitting at home in this lockdown situation by myself, wondering, what should I think about ethical and intellectual wrongs, and how should I approach this question that Clifford is asking, or this question that Peirce has, and engaging in an internal dialogue, and it can help by having that dialogue happen in these sort of forms that you're speaking of. I think unfortunately sometimes that doesn't happen, and that could be for all sorts of reasons, right? I tend to clam up a bit if I'm around many people and people I don't recognize, and I'm starting to wonder, okay, are they thinking that the ideas that I have or the statements I'm making are just preposterous, or do they think I'm out to lunch when I'm making these claims? And I think anyone who doesn't approach this discipline through dialogue and through an approach where you want to at least open your mind to something other that's what's in your own mind at the moment, really isn't approaching it in the right way.
Yeah. I mean, that's why
we got to question what we take for granted, right? And especially the sort of suppositions that we're making, and sometimes the ones that we don't see, especially when our beliefs are so strong. Sorry, go ahead.
Or you have such a narrow, like you work on a project for so long from one angle that you're just not seeing what could be a very obviously relevant perspective, but you're just not seeing it. But I mean, I think that's why I like the idea of something like this rather than just going to a conference or something. Or having someone over for a colloquium. It can be interesting, but it can also be really problematic because, like you said, you don't necessarily know the person. You may not necessarily be all that familiar with their work, and yet you're trying to have some sort of meaningful dialogue that you're trying to do in like the span of 2 minutes as you kind of fumble through an awkward question, and maybe you get a response. And
that's right.
Yeah. It's not always the most effective means of doing that kind of thing, and yeah, I wonder if maybe there's a better way to do it.
This could be it. Yeah.
Maybe. I mean, I hope to be able to invite lots of different people to this, and to maybe really give a chance for us as perhaps a sort of regional philosophical community to kind of better understand what we're all up to, and why we're doing these things, and how they can be relevant in ways that we don't always see.
That is definitely worthwhile. I think it's an important project. I like it in so many ways.
Maybe we'll have to do another one. We'll have a pragmatist. We'll just have a pragmatist episode, and we'll have
a round table.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. I'd be down for that.
A virtual round table.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It sounds good. I mean,
there's
I'm even fine with people who are non-pragmatists, but
yeah,
I learn from them too.
Well, what I'd like to do is have maybe have a grad student or someone come on and talk about their work, and then have somebody else who's not from that field at all and sort of have that conversation where that one person kind of explains, things to somebody who may not be familiar with it, but they, through a longer conversation, maybe more can come out of it.
I usually find that helpful, particularly when I have to explain something to someone who doesn't know much about it, but is an intelligent person and can, ask me all kinds of questions that I might not have thought of.
Alrighty, well, this has been, I think, a pretty fascinating conversation about Peirce and Clifford and the meaning of evidence and what we need for knowledge and the importance of these things in the context of the larger sort of social setting and who is claiming to know what and why. I think making our ideas clear in this way is probably one of the most important things we could do. So joining me today was Dr. Ian MacDonald from the University of Waterloo. Ian, I want to thank you for joining me.
Thanks very much for having me on. It's been excellent.
Yeah, you're a great first guest. I really enjoyed the conversation, and hopefully we can have you back on later on.
I've really enjoyed it. Thanks again, Matt.
Yep, alrighty. Okay, so thank you for joining us. This has been episode 1 of Reconstructing Philosophy podcast, and look forward to seeing you again. Okay, alrighty. Well, thank you. Bye-bye.